بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونتوب إليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا ومن يهد الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله sallallahu alayhi wa sallam wa ba'd. So as I said, this is a ongoing series that we've been doing on Dawah. Dawah Discussions is the title that we've given it. It's essentially a loosely organized fiqh of Dawah, if you will. We've been speaking for the last 4 or 5 weeks on various aspects of Dawah. We've spoken about the pillars of Dawah, the call, the caller, and the called, which we completed last week. Today we begin some more general topics. Tonight is going to be the way Sheikh Bilal Phillips, Hafidhullah, organized it, was he referred to it as general dawah issues. So these are essentially those difficult topics that come up when you're talking to somebody about Islam and Muslims, and some answers or some possible responses to those particular questions. So we'll try and go through everything that he has here. We may have to skip through some of it a little faster than others. And at the outset, I want to stress, keep in mind the context into which Sheikh Bilal was writing. He was writing this program for an audience in Qatar. So there are some things that are going to be slightly disconnected from the reality we have in the West, because he was writing to a Middle Eastern audience. Even though they were expats, they had unique challenges that we don't face in the West. And just as a refresher, my name is Imam Saeed Purcell. I work for the outreach department here at the Islamic Center of Irving. And so any matters relating to sharing Islam with others, whether co-workers or family or friends, etc., feel free to reach out to me. Feel free to contact us here at ICI, and we are happy to help. That's why we're here, inshallah. So general dawah issues. The first point that he brings up, or the first, if you will, difficult issue that he brings up, is the topic that is brought up sometimes where Muslim men are accused of being polygamists, that they are inherently bigamous. They have multiple women, they have multiple wives, and this is something that is used as an accusation against Muslim men in particular that you come across. You'll find a lot of the ones that he talks about are related to women's issues, because that's a major attacking point for much of the West. So men are often accused of being promiscuous because polygamy is legal in Islam. I'm assuming many of you have probably heard something like this in the past. So he brings up a number of different points to address this topic, some of which you may have never heard before. So first one, this one should be relatively obvious. Islam did not introduce polygamy. Polygamy existed long before Islam came on the scene in terms of the mission of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. He was not the first one to introduce the concept of multiple wives. It existed prior to his being sent. It existed, if you look at and you are familiar with the Bible and the Old Testament in particular, actually all, depending on how you read it, all from Adam all the way through had more than one wife. All of them. All of the major figures in biblical stories had more than one wife. In some cases, famously, they'll talk about Solomon, Suleiman, having, I don't remember how many wives they said that he had, but it was dozens, and something like 700 concubines. So far from something invented by Muslims in Islam. First thing. Very simple thing to know. And he mentions that this is something that's been practiced in most of human societies throughout all of history. It's not something that's unique to the Middle East. It's not something that's unique to Islam. It's not something that's unique really in any way, shape, or form. It's existed in one form or another pretty much since the dawn of man. Second one, Mentions monogamy of the West. In other words, monogamy as we understand it in the West is something that was inherited from Greece and Rome, because they talk about Western society being a Greco-Roman society, because its heritage is from Greece and Rome, Greece and Roman society. And so if you look at the practice of monogamy or one man, one woman relationships in Greece and Rome in ancient times, he explains, it says, men were restricted by law to one wife. But in the time in that era and in that place, they had completely unrestricted access to as many mistresses and concubines and slave women as they chose. So it was monogamy in name only, or legal monogamy only, but there was the ability to be quite proliferate with many other women than just your one legal wife. So the concept of monogamy from Greco-Roman culture is a fallacy. It doesn't exist, not in the way that people intend it when they say it. Next thing he mentions is that it's illogical. To talk about monogamy, the idea that a one man, one woman is illogical, that there's no logic to it. And so this is how he explains it. He says, if a man wishes to have a second wife, Islamically, if he wishes to have a second wife, he marries her legally, it's open, it's public, everything's known. He takes on responsibility for her, for the children, he has to provide for them, all of the usual responsibilities that are associated with any sort of family structure. In the West, this is considered a crime, and you can be put in jail. However, you can claim to be monogamous, have one wife, and you can have as many mistresses and girlfriends and visit as many prostitutes as you want, and that's perfectly legal. This is the logic, or the lack of logic, that exists in this particular practice. The next point he makes, and this one you could maybe take some contention with, but he says, men were created polygamous. By nature, men desire multiple mates because of need in human society. But here's his logic, here's his reasoning, and there's some argument to be made from him. He says, there is normally a surplus of women. What does that mean? That means when you count the number of women and you count the number of men, the number of women is more. So if you were to restrict it to one man, one woman, what would that do? That would leave a host of women without the ability to have any valid relationship with a man. If that's the only acceptable form of relationship, you have now condemned a certain number of women to spinsterhood, to being alone and having to face all of the difficulties that come with being alone. Just simple logic, simple numbers. And he gives statistics in the background, but suffice it to say, pretty much all across the world, even today, the women outnumber the men, historically. That is true for antiquity. And part of it is because men are frequently the victims of violence at a much higher rate than women, whether it's war or violent crime or even disease. They are dying younger and more quickly than women. And as is generally known, women on average outlive men. The statistic he put in the footnotes, and this is old, so this is dated, but women's lifespan is something like 78 when he was writing this, and men's was 71. So by necessity, there's going to be more women because they live longer. And statistically, there's more of them. The only places you find where women don't outnumber men are, generally speaking, two countries, India and China, both of which have a cultural practice that has existed in some cases up until today, where girl children are killed at birth. So the females, although they would normally outnumber the males, are being eradicated so that the number is artificially tweaked in the other direction. That's the only place that you find the numbers in the other way, where the men outnumber the women in that instance. And he made an interesting point here, and he references the upsurge in homosexuality and how that is the corruption in society. He gives an interesting example about how men are killed in great numbers during wars and things like that. So World War II in the 40s, in the West predominantly, obviously, many men were killed in these wars. And just as a side point, and you may not have ever heard this, whenever anybody tries to accuse Islam of being bloodthirsty, he actually didn't mention it in his points when we get to it. But the bloodiest, or actually the total number of people that were killed during the lifetime of the Prophet in all of the battles and skirmishes that took place on both sides, believers and disbelievers, the total number in all 23 years that died doesn't begin to compare to the single death toll in one battle in most of the world wars. You can pick one battle in the entirety of the war, and that single battle, the number of dead will exceed the totality of the dead in the entire lifetime of the Prophet on both sides. So how is he referred to as a warmonger and bloodthirsty, but they killed 10 times as many people in one fight and no one says anything? Just a side point. I was just watching something about that recently, that's why it's fresh in my mind. But he gives the example after World War II, where many men had died, and especially in Germany. He's referencing Germany in particular. In Germany, initially, they talked about legalizing polygamy because there were so many women and very few men because so many had died. They didn't pass the rule to allow polygamy. However, what they did pass was legalizing prostitution. They legalized prostitution, and I believe as he's writing this, he's intending this to mean at the current time when he was writing this, prostitution is legal in the country. They actually have health insurance and identity cards and have all sorts of protections. They pay taxes just like anybody else. It's a regular, if you will, 9-to-5 job to be a prostitute in Germany. And this is a holdover from World War II because they were trying to figure out how do you contend with the situation where you have this surplus of women and this very small number of men. How do you handle it? So their solution, legalize prostitution. Next thing he mentions is anthropologists, people that study human history. They argue that polygamy is a genetic trait by which the strongest genes of the generation, essentially this is Darwin, the survival of the fittest, that the ones that carry on are the ones that are able to produce the most children. And so this is something that is inherent in the biology and the history of the species, if you will. That this is the way people continue. So he gives the example of the lion, the strongest one, monopolizes the females and has the most children. Not sure how strong that argument is necessarily. Yeah, exactly. That's why I'm not so sure how good that particular point is that he made. He talks about institutional polygamy, prevents the spread of diseases. So in other words, allowing polygamy on a governmental or a legal scale, so that's something that's sanctioned by society, it prevents the spread of sexually transmitted diseases because married couples have a very low incident rate, obviously, for obvious reasons, of sexually transmitted diseases because they're not sleeping carelessly and randomly with people that they don't know, what their status is. When you have legal marriages, people are much more careful and their practices are much more safe. And so it's a way of getting that under control because it spreads in illicit sex outside of marriage. And so when you take away that factor, it becomes much more controlled. And he talks about, and this is an interesting one, how polygamy actually protects the interests of women and children in society. Now this runs counterintuitive to what the West would tell you, obviously. They argue that it's the other way around. It says in Western society, men are the ones that make the laws, and they like to keep polygamy illegal because it absolves them of responsibility. They talked about how they might have one wife, but they'll have as many mistresses and lovers and prostitutes and everything else as they choose. And they generally take no responsibility for those. It's basically a get out of jail free card. So legalized polygamy require them to spend on their additional wives and offspring, and monogamy allows them to enjoy all of these affairs without any economic consequences. There's no bill to pay at the end of the day. You have your fun and you walk away, and there's no consequence for you, etc. The woman has to bear the burden of the brunt of all of that, with the children and all of the associated difficulties that come with. And if you ever look at any sociological writings, one of the greatest detriments to society is fatherless children. There's so much research that traces so many of the things that are wrong in society to children growing up without fathers in the household. That is a huge factor. It's not the only factor, obviously, but it's a huge factor in contributing to the sort of social ills that we see. And so it's perpetuating its own destruction, essentially, if you will. Another one. This is an interesting one that people don't necessarily know, but it's a very, very interesting one to throw at people. When people complain about Muslims having more than one wife, it says only a minority will actually practice polygamy, even in societies where it's legal. And he gives the example here that in spite of it being legal in many Muslim countries, only 10 to 15% actually practice it. And that's true even with people that can afford it, because it's not just the financial burden, it's also the psychological burden that you bear in trying to manage two households. Many of us, we know the challenges we face with just one. So this is the thing, is that people don't understand that there's this perception that it's so rampant in Muslim society, but it's not true. It's 10 to 15% according to his research. Now, interestingly, he tells a story as a side point here about Dawah. And this is one of the interesting things about the confusion that people can get because of the misinformation that is spread. There was a man in England that he had contact with me. He was doing his PhD in England. And he was very convinced of Islam and the oneness of God and everything else, even the messengership of the Prophet ﷺ. But he was holding back from actually taking his shahada. And when they pressed him about the issue, he said, I really am convinced about Islam, but I love my wife. And it didn't make sense at first why that was the reason that he wouldn't take his shahada. He said, I really love my wife. I don't want to take, other wives. He thought that the way he was made to understand it, that the minute you became Muslim, you had to have 4 wives. That was part of the equation. Muslim, 4 wives. And so that was what was holding him back from giving his shahada, was because he was left with the impression that he had to take more wives if he became Muslim, and he couldn't do it because he said he loves his wife. Huh? Would have been an interesting condition for people. That might encourage some people to become Muslim and the opposite for others. So the minority, it's a big minority. It's a very small minority, I should say, that actually practices polygamy in the first place. And he talks about here how conditions have been added for polygamy in many countries. In Egypt, he gives the example that permission of the first wife has to be obtained before a man can take a second wife. And this is similar to conditions and this and similar ones are the result of colonialism, is what he says, because they're trying to appeal to Western minds and Western sensibilities. That it doesn't seem right that the man can take one with just no responsibility or no reference back to the woman. No woman in her right mind will give her husband permission to take a second wife. Such a condition, in fact, negates the permission. So here he talks about claiming that you have to get the permission of the woman negates what the Quran says. We'll get to it. I know it sounds a little awkward at hearing it like this, but we'll get to the other part of this. But the idea that you're setting conditions that don't exist in the Sharia. And this is very common because people are embarrassed or uncomfortable about the subject of multiple wives. And so they try to justify it, or they try to try to sanitize it by making it look a particular way. Others have accepted it as long as it's not being done for lust. The gist of the point that he makes here is that if you say the second marriage can't be for quote unquote lust, what's the basis for it? Because the first marriage was because of lust, at least at some level. So how do you accept it for the first one and reject it for the second one as a criteria? Then he touches on the idea about feminism being, objecting to this being the right of the woman, that she should also be able to practice polygamy. The women should also be able to have multiple husbands. And his argument here is that a woman marrying 4 husbands would only increase the problem of surplus women. So we already established that historically and generally across the globe and throughout history, women have outnumbered men. So if one woman was marrying multiple men, that would leave even fewer men for the remaining women. It would only make the problem worse. So that's part of the argument he makes. The other one he said is that it confuses paternity. Granted, with blood tests and things like that, paternity is less of a concern, but he says no child would be willing to accept his mother going, "Your father? Oh, eeny, meeny, miny, mo." And that's the way she identifies which one was the father of the child. So again, that's another one of them where the argument is not the strongest that he particularly makes in that instance. The last one he mentions here is the question, if God is good and wishes good for his creatures, why did he legislate something which would be harmful to women? So this is bad for women is the argument. It says divine legislation looks at the society as a whole, maximizing the benefit. If certain legislation benefits the majority of society and causes some emotional harm to a minority, the general welfare is given precedence. So this is the essence where if a large number of people are benefited by a law and there's a small number that will be inconvenienced by that law, generally speaking, that is not going to rule out that law being instituted, because the general welfare of society is what's desired. And if there's a significant majority that's benefited by it, it goes through. So that's the argument. And he didn't mention it here. I think he actually mentions it in another place where we talked about the issue of the permission, etc. He talks about divorce. Actually, we'll get to that. I won't jump the gun, actually. Muslims are often accused of forcing their daughters into marriage. Another one that we've probably heard. Forced marriages. Islamic law requires that females give their permission before they are married. This is something that should be well known. It's a statement of the Prophet that the permission of virgins should be taken, and their silence is their consent. In other words, if they truly didn't want the marriage, they would say something. If they remain silent because of their innocence and their shyness, they may not speak to say, "Yeah, I like him." They may not be willing to do that, but they'll if they really don't want it, the theory is they'll speak up because of the harm that might be associated with that. So, and he gives an example of one woman who came to the Prophet ﷺ after she had been married and said, "My father married me without my consent." And he offered to annul the marriage in that instance. And she said, "No, I'm happy with him. I just wanted to make sure people knew that this was their right." So she was actually very much a leader in that respect, is that although she had been married without her consent, this had been a few years earlier, and she had grown up, matured, she'd grown up to love and care for her husband. But she wanted other women to realize that that was not the way things were supposed to be done. So she asked and got that clarification publicly so others would know. It was essentially a teaching moment for the other women in the community. Mentions also how Muslims are encouraged to help their children find their partners, since generally speaking in Muslim societies, granted this is less true than it was at another time, that males and females are raised separately. That's becoming less true overseas than it used to be, but it's still more true than it is here, obviously. So women are spared having to look for their own mates, etc. And he mentions from a Western perspective, teenagers are often required to leave home and work and care for themselves. So to the Western mind, it would seem ludicrous to say, now you have to let your parents choose your spouse, because they disowned them essentially, beforehand. And so it's like, yeah, no, we got nothing to do with you, but oh no, you want to get married? Come back here. That's not going to fly well with most kids. It has become practiced in some Muslims to force their children to marry their cousins. For Muslims in the West, this becomes a means to help members reach the West. So there have been a number of cases reported. So he talks about where girls are rescued at the airport from quote unquote forced marriages and things like that. And he talks about how the danger is that they're going to be distanced from their religion, possibly lose their Islam, and who knows what the outcomes might be because of this unnatural compulsion that people are being put under to be into a marriage. And just as a side point, this idea of putting undue pressure on the boy or the girl, really, to get married is actually self-defeating. If you genuinely care about and love your children and you want them to be happy, you want them to be on board and accepting of the relationship so that there's a strong chance of its success. If they're feeling compelled, especially if they grew up here, if they're feeling compelled or forced into a decision that they're not on board with, the society is not going to stop them from immediately jettisoning that relationship the first chance they get. Either sabotaging a relationship, getting a divorce, or just having it be a completely loveless or worse marriage. So you want to be cautious about compelling your children into marriage. You want them to be part of that process as much as possible so that they are, because again, at the end of the day, no matter how much we want to guide and chaperone our children into their decisions because we have experience, because we have obviously more knowledge from our life and everything else, but at the end of the day, that marriage is those two people. So no matter how much we guide them and try to advise them, at the end of the day, when they go home, it's the two of them alone in that house, or the two of them alone in that bedroom. So you want that relationship between them to be solid and to be mutual. You don't want one to feel like they were forced to be with the other, because that doesn't necessarily lead to good outcomes many times.
I think it's more like cultural versus like forced marriages, honestly. It's more related to culture, not
Right. No, frequently what you'll find is that's usually people that are still relatively, their ties to the home country are still very strong, and so those cultural habits or those other things, they're still more strongly felt and have a greater influence on the way that they do things. Generally speaking, when people have been here long enough, the society does a pretty good job of trying to wipe those ideas out of their mind. Not always for the better sometimes, but it tends to eradicate them. The next one he brings up is Muslim women not being able to marry themselves. Not meaning that I do, okay, no, not that. But meaning that they give themselves away in marriage. This is what it's referring to. And so it's similar to what the discussion that he just said, that it requires the permission of a girl's father, a woman's father, for a marriage to be valid. And he quotes the Prophet here about essentially that there's la nikah illa bil wali, that there is no union, there is no marriage without a wali, without a guardian being involved. And so again, from the Western perspective, children in their teens are told to leave the house, take care of themselves, go live on their own, everything else. Now for you to do all of that and then try and go, no, come back here. You're going to get married, you got to talk to me first. You booted them out of the house, you made them pay for everything themselves, and then you're trying to tell them that you're going to have this sway over their life decision because of how you did it. So that's going to be a hard sell most of the time, and that's relatively logical. The woman the Muslim woman, he says, lives a sheltered life. Traditionally, obviously, she's not used to dealing with men outside of her blood relatives. So the mahram, the father will be more capable of judging the young man. The young woman could be fooled or sweet talked. This is the role of ours when we're acting as a wali for our daughters or for any girl. If it's not our direct, daughter or whatever, if we're stepping in the role for someone who doesn't have a wali, and we've been asked to do so by the imam or something like that,
we're trying to safeguard these girls from the trickery that men sometimes use to get what they want. It's
Of guardian is only for virgin girls. For widow and for the divorce,
there's some discussion around how much of a role they have in that point. At the end of the day, the woman does have more of a say when she's been previously married, but that doesn't, generally speaking, they don't fully absolve the role of a wali being there, but his approval is less required than it was previously, because the theory is, at least, that she knows what she's getting into. His advice is still valuable, and the ability to read. I mean, and most of us as men, we know that we can pick up on things that men say and do that women many times don't recognize. And that's the role that we serve, whether in that scenario or a girl who's never been married and had no experiences or anything like that, completely innocent in that regard. So, but protecting them in those instances from being tricked or used, and sadly, I've had far too much experience, it happens way more often than you think. And I'll say this, and this is one of my biggest pains. It happens a lot to converts in particular. Convert sisters are often targeted by people who are looking for easy marriages with inequities, marriages that try to take advantage of people for various reasons or purposes, etc. So it's very, very important. Because like in these scenarios, you may have someone who's been married before or had relationships before, as most converts usually have, unless they converted very young. They don't understand Islamic marital guidelines and structures. So men who, if they tried to marry a girl from back home, know they would never get away with certain things with that girl. They may try and find a convert because that convert is ignorant. And they can tell them whatever they want, and they will likely believe them, or they will likely go along with it. And so they can achieve certain objectives with them that they know they could have never achieved with a girl from back home, because she would know better, or she would have family who would know better, and she would have protection. So there is still a danger to it in certain contexts. But you are absolutely right. If the guardian refuses for illegitimate reasons, then the judge can step in, etc. So he was talking about that there is ways to facilitate the marriage when there's unreasonableness being utilized. And he talks about the double standard. This is the Muslim men marrying non-Muslim women, and Muslim women not being able to marry non-Muslim men, and some of the answers to that. And one of the first things, and this is an important distinction to make, is that it's not, as is usually presented, a blanket permission for Muslim men to marry non-Muslim women. That's an oversimplification. It's people of the book first, and we generally know that people of the book, so Jews and Christians generally, are the ones that are considered acceptable. However, it doesn't stop there. It's a Ahlika Kitab Muhsinat. Muhsinat meaning that they are chaste women. So the example he gives here is that either they're virgins, or they're divorced or widowed. In other words, they were in a legally valid relationship. That is the only way that they were intimate with people. So not, as the example he gives, is people that come over and they look for the beautiful girl in the nightclub or at the bar or wherever, and they start dating her and they're doing whatever. I can't tell you how many times I've had people come to me to learn about Islam, and they're dating a Muslim and they're doing everything. And sometimes, ironically enough, they're dating a Muslim, doing everything that we associate with dating in the West. They become interested in Islam. They come, they learn about Islam. They become Muslim, mashallah. And then they become better Muslims than the boyfriend or girlfriend that they're dating. And then they separate because they're too religious now. The one that converted becomes too religious for the one that was their like doorway. it's very, very sad. But so it's this thing. It's not just women from the Jewish or Christian communities, but chaste women from the Jewish or Christian community. There's far too much recklessness in the way that we handle this because we just let it fly without any guidelines or any standards at all. It's supposed to be chaste. And he makes the point, he's like trying to find a quote unquote chaste woman in the West these days is like the proverbial needle in a haystack is the way he worded it, which is not an exaggeration because the rates, I haven't seen, I don't remember them recently, but it's very high. In high school, in general in the West, well over 50% are sexually active. Well over 50% are sexually active. I don't have the graph, actually, let me look. There was a study done of Muslim college students and what their practices were like. It looks like I did delete it. The rate of sexual activity and drinking and drugs in Muslim children in college, much higher than you might think. We're talking on the order of half to a third in most of those categories. We want to tell ourselves a particular story, but when you actually talk to them, that story is not holding true. They just don't feel comfortable talking to you or me about it. So don't be deluded about the sort of dating practices and activities that are going on, even amongst our own youth. So but it's very important to keep that in mind, this idea of being chaste, that is part of the condition. The other reason, he mentions the reason for allowing men and not women is in order to protect the woman's religion, the Muslim woman. So here, this is a very simple logic, and I've shared this with people in the past. So a Muslim man who marries a Christian or Jewish woman, if he asks her not to cook pork, that's not going to violate any religious tenet of hers. If he asks her to dress modestly, that's not going to violate any religious tenet of hers. If he asks her to not be too friendly with his guests when they come to the house, hugging or kissing or whatever that might be the norm, that's not going to violate any religious edicts for her. She's still going to be able to be a good practicing Christian or Jew and follow her husband's dictates. However, if you turn that around and you have a Christian husband and a Muslim wife, there's nothing to prevent him from eating pork. So if he tells his wife, I need you to go get a pork chop from the meat shop and cook it up, we've got guests coming. Make sure to put on that short dress I got you the other day, and they really like your legs. Make sure to kiss them when they come in too. Any one of those would require her to compromise her deen. She would be put into a situation where it is obey her husband and lose her deen, or save her deen and disobey her husband. So it's a mercy for the woman that if she's, again, a woman is only going to care about it if they care about their deen, but if they care about their deen, they really can't even consider a non-Muslim man because they're going to expose themselves to the likely scenario where you're going to wind up being asked to compromise your faith in very real ways. And that doesn't get into some of the other unspeakable things that he could ask her to do that he might not see any compunction religiously to avoid. That is a sin for her to do. And if she loves him, she wants to make him happy, and she'll feel pressure to compromise. So it's trying to protect her from that burden, from that choice of sacrificing her faith to keep this man happy. And he mentions here also about being discouraged in cases where Muslims are in a weaker state. So for instance, leaving aside the permissibility of, marrying people of the book, given the condition we spoke about, being muhsinat, being chaste women from the people of the book. In our situation here in the US, we are, depending on the statistics you look at, 2% of the society. Maybe. Here in Dallas, a little higher probably. Still, we're a very small minority, regardless of what the number is and in whatever neighborhood you're in. In that scenario, many scholars would argue that is at least highly discouraged, if not bordering on forbidden, to marry outside of the faith. Because you're taking a position of weakness and only making it weaker. Exactly. Similar to what we were talking about with the polygamy and the greater number of women versus the number of men. If Muslims in our situation in this area here, if Muslims are marrying non-Muslims, men obviously, if Muslim men are marrying non-Muslim girls, that leaves fewer men who are already in a minority in the first place for the larger number of sisters to find for marriage. So just as a corollary, and I know the sisters aren't going to like to hear this, that creates an even greater argument for the need for multiple marriages. Because if the brothers are marrying outside of the faith, that's fewer for the sisters who are more already. That leaves a smaller pool, which means you gotta team up. You gotta share resources here. That's not something that people want to hear, but that's the reality of it. That's the reality of it. So yeah, no, absolutely. We need to be mindful of that fact that we want to nurture the relationships amongst our kids so that we can keep the community strong and growing and not diluting potentially. Now the next one is, where are we? We may stop after this one. Divorce is easy in Islam. Anybody who's ever been divorced here probably knows that's not as true as it sounds. So in reality, it's not easy, he says. There are conditions, first and foremost. You can't just say, do it anytime you want. You can just blanketly with no reason or causes that you can't be pronounced when the woman is on her cycle. So you have to time it according to that. And he talks about the reasons as far as the psychological effects that the period has on the woman in general. And in some cases, it can be very, very extreme. I've never actually seen the proof of this, but I've heard this on more than one occasion, that there have been women who have literally got off with murder because of PMS. That their PMS, their premenstrual syndrome, the out of sorts that they get around that time was so severe for them that they were able to justify the fact that they had killed someone based on that. But that's the level of, lack of reasoned thinking that can ensue at that time. And as men, I'm sure we've experienced various levels and experiences with this. It happens, and it's not to be unkind to the women. This is part of the nature of what Allah has created. They have this challenge, but then their bodies do amazing things that we can't even fathom. And for what? Oh, divorce is too. Well, if you do it there, you have to reset. If you do it during the period, you have to reset. You can't complete it. It doesn't. It'll.
Like divorce rate in Muslims is way less than the rest.
Actually, the statistics recently are showing that it's roughly equal. Yeah. The rates have been going up and up and up for Muslim couples. It's far more common, far more common than it used to be. And I've seen some where it's dead equal with general society.
Muslims in West or overall?
I believe that was specifically the West, although it's going up overseas too. Just that the rates obviously are a little different overseas than they are here because there's still some of the societal pressures and things like that that you don't have as much here. Here, the society will, help push that conversation along, needless to say. But so talking about the reasons for that, and that it can't be pronounced when the menses. Also, a man can't do it if he's extremely angry. Extreme rage, the sort where you're starting to yourself begin to lose your reason, is another reason that a divorce may not be acceptable. And if you think about when many times when people blurt out divorce, even if the timing is right in terms of the cycle, it's generally what? You're hot-headed, you're really upset, you're in a very intense argument sometimes. That's generally not going to be you can't say that it's not acceptable because that's a specific scenario thing that you have to investigate. But intense rage is something that begins to call into question the pronouncement itself because you're not thinking right. And this is true. I do pastoral counseling for couples. In pastoral counseling for couples, one of the concepts that they talk about is what's called DPA, or diffuse physical arousal. What they're talking about is when a person gets what they call flooded. When you get into an argument or you're having a disagreement with your spouse, you get to a certain point where, as my father used to put it, you see red. You're becoming very, very angry. You're becoming enraged. And your body is starting to change. Your heart rate is going up. Your breathing is getting shallow. And that it's not just a phrase. Most of the time we thought it was, you just see red, I can't see straight. My father loved to say that he was so mad he can't see straight. Turns out that's not as far-fetched as it sounds. When you get into this state, when you become overly aroused and agitated in terms of emotion, your vision does a tunnel vision thing. You literally don't see straight, or actually more accurately, you see only straight. You begin to have tunnel vision. You only see a certain thing, and you're not hearing things the way that you normally would. You're beginning to have selective hearing, or your brain isn't operating the same way. Your eyes, your ears, your senses, everything is verifiably operating differently. It's not like anecdotes. It's not like a fancy, a pretty way of describing it. No, this is verifiable in clinic. They can show you on a graph to show you what happens when you get there. It's like, oh my God, you went here. You can see it. It's not a stretch, and so you literally are not in your right mind. And so they say you need to step away in those scenarios because you're not going to have a productive conversation at that moment because you cannot think straight. You're not going to do. This is where you talk about, many of us, I'm sure we've all had the experience where we've said something that we don't realize it until later, and then we come and we're like, I can't believe I said that. That was probably DPA. You were probably that worked up that you were triggered. And you only come to your senses a little while later. And that's why they say you got to step away. Do anything else but think about the argument for at least 20 minutes. And that makes a huge difference, again, clinically verifiable difference in handling the argument. But so anger.
That's why, like, single sitting, you cannot divorce.
Right, that's one of the arguments, and that's where I would argue based on some of these facts, because it's still a debate about 3 and 1, or 1 by 1. What is it? 3 and 1. There's different opinions about whether it counts as 1 or it counts as 3. Based on that fact, I would argue that most of the time, 3 and 1 is going to be, no, we're going to have to count that as 1 because you probably weren't in your right mind. And there's plenty of opinions that will say that it's just 1, but there's other opinions that say 3 and 1, all right, that's 3, you're done, no chance of going back. And it depends on the situation. You'll hear some sheikhs where they get a situation and they hear the whole context of the conversation. He did 3 and 1. They may believe that the legal opinion is that 3 and 1 is just 1, but in that scenario, because of the relationship or the nature of the argument or what was going on, he's like, no, in this case, 3 is 3, you're done, no chance of coming back. Because they're like, these people need to be separated. They have enough information that they're like, these two people need to be separated. It's like, whether it's technically 3 and 1 or 1 and 3, whatever, they need to be separated, so we're calling that 3 and 3. Done. It depends on the situation, which is the thing with fatwas. Fatwas are situational. That's why, in general, you do not transpose fatwas from one person to another. In general.
It's like special case versus general.
Right. A fatwa, generally speaking, is going to be a specific answer to a specific question in a very specific scenario. And just to give you an example, one of the interesting ways, and we'll actually stop on this because, yeah, I'll skip through that. We'll get to this other part next time. Generally speaking, with fatwas, this was something in a seminar that I was in a few years ago, where we were discussing at length, a large group of imams were discussing at length research on fatwas. And there was a really interesting quote that was brought up, if I remember correctly, by Imam Nawawi, rahmatullahi alayh, talking about the purpose of fatwas. And it runs contrary to what most of our experiences with fatwa is. Most of our experiences with fatwa are what is halal and haram. That is most of our experiences with fatwa. But Imam Nawawi's response to it was to say that the purpose of mufti is not to pronounce halal and haram. Anybody can do that. Because it's clear, like the Prophet said in the one hadith, that the halal is clear and the haram is clear. And between those things are, ambiguous matters. But the mufti's role is to find a way for the person to accomplish their objective while remaining true to their deen. In other words, in whatever way is acceptable religiously, to facilitate their request. So like, we'll use the home buying example. You look for any legitimate scenario where their situation would permit them to use conventional mortgage, for instance. But that's their situation. That's based on very specific conditions that are unique to them that you can't transpose unless your situation is exactly like theirs. That is for them and them alone. That's what his argument was, is that your role is to find a way for them to accomplish their objective while remaining true to the deen. It's not to pronounce halal and haram. It's to find the way to facilitate their request and allow them to stay true to the deen itself. So when you approach a fatwa like that, it changes your thinking process. It changed my thinking process on fatwa hugely. Because when people come to you, it's like, okay, this is what they're trying to do. Is there some way? And just as a side point, when they talked about this, one of the other things we talked about is whether or not you can go between madhabs to find a ruling for a question that you're answering. And the general answer, and it's been a while since I covered all of this in detail, the general answer was yes, you can. You can be, say, Hanafi, but inclined towards a Hanbali position in this particular issue because it serves your interest better, or the evidence seems to be more relevant, or something like that, etc. It is possible. It is allowable. It's not seen as the awful thing that it's sometimes presented as. That's, again, a gross simplification of the conversation, but that's the gist of it. The idea being, again, is this idea that you're facilitating the person accomplishing their objective while remaining true to the deen. So you look for it. That's wherever there's not something clear, where there's like a consensus of the scholars that this is either halal or haram, then that means there's latitude. And so the way they were speaking about it is that in that context, you want to find that latitude for the person that's asking so that they can accomplish their goal and still be safe, inshallah. That's my cue. Inshallah, we didn't finish. We only got about halfway. I wasn't surprised by that, honestly. So we'll pick up where we left off, inshallah, next week. Say again? If in this last thing that I just said, the thing about all these misconceptions, the writings. This is Sheikh Bilal Phillips. Yeah, this is Sheikh Bilal Phillips. That most of what I'm bouncing off of is his writing right now. Diffuse physical arousal. Right.
You did a good job by continuing by the Sheikh of Mobina Bilal Phillips. Did a lot of du'as, so we continue on that to have a good effect on the people. The one thing I wanted to say is that when you look at the pluralistic of wives, the people out there, they think that Muslims, they are very promiscuous, but they don't look at the whole picture of Islam. People, they do the zina, they get a tremendous amount of punishment. They're stoned to death. When people, they hear about that, they become shocked.
Right.
No, the important thing is, no, in Islam, people, everybody's going to agree that it's correct, it's right, because it's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's just people that have the wrong ideas, the wrong
Right.
conceptions. But it's, you know, you invite them and talk to them more, and when they understand, they see the whole thing, then they'll realize it and they'll follow.
No, and this is.
You have their spirit behind you, you have their tongue
Alhamdulillah.
behind you, you have their du'as behind you, and Allah will have a
And I want to echo something that he touched on very briefly here. Is one of the things, and this is true for us many times when we're learning, where I came across it the most poignantly is that when you're first learning certain ahadith, and you learn them in isolation, so it's just a random hadith that you might hear or read somewhere, you see it or you'll read it and you think, that seems strange, that seems out of place, that seems almost wrong sometimes because it runs contrary to things that you either know or have heard. Many times that's because we haven't, as he was alluding to, we haven't seen it in the greater context of everything else. When you read like a book of hadith from cover to cover, when I say this, I'm talking like, like Sunan al-Tirmidhi, which I have read cover to cover, or a Bukhari or a Muslim or something like that, but you read from beginning to end because they didn't do that, they didn't collect that haphazardly. There was a great wisdom in how they organized it and why they collected what they did and everything else. So if you can go from beginning to end, things you stumble across here and there suddenly start to make a lot of sense because what you've done now is you've completed the puzzle. The picture doesn't look right at first as you're only halfway through the puzzle. You have to wait until you finish putting all the pieces in their places. Then you see the picture clearly and then you're like, oh, that's where that went and why that was there.
the non-Muslims, they think that Muslims are, they do a lot of zina and things like that, but they don't realize that it's the opposite. Islam prohibits
Ayah
zina.
which actually allows polygamy. And in its context, it was talking about the orphans and taking care of them, and it puts very strict condition of balance and justice.
Right.
So I think polygamy is a reality. It's not a general.
Well, I'll tell you, I'll close on this. So I read something recently about this idea of, the criticism about Muslims and multiple wives. If you look at all of the other revealed religions in their books, none of them specifically state one wife, except for the Quran. The Quran is the only one that says if you fear you can't do justice, then only one. Only scripture that says that. All of the others, no matter how much they push for monogamy, quote unquote, we've already talked about how much of a farce that is, but monogamy, none of their scriptures speak of one wife. The only one that does is the one that gets the most grief for permitting limited polygyny, which is the correct term actually, polygyny. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
الله أكبر.